Family is supposed to mean safety, trust, and continuity. The people who stand by you, no matter what storms arrive. But what happens when the person you trusted most decides to cash in that trust, to erase your name from what you built together, and sell away the very heartbeat of your family's legacy? That's the moment I found myself staring at. The betrayal didn't come from a stranger or a competitor. It came from someone who sat at my own table, someone who carried my last name. He thought he was clever, moving papers around quietly, preparing to sell the family business as if I would never notice. What he didn't know was that while he was plotting in silence, I had already made a move of my own. By the time his scheme came to light, the deed was no longer in his control. It was already in mine. Our story did not begin with profits, contracts, or glossy offices. It began with sweat that soaked through shirts, with hands that blistered and healed, only to blister again. My grandfather opened the first doors of the family business with little more than a loan he could barely repay and a determination he refused to surrender. The shop was not just a building, it was a beating heart. Every brick, every shelf, carried the weight of sacrifices layered across generations. My father grew up in that space, learning the rhythm of the work before he even understood the numbers. He knew the names of loyal customers, remembered their stories, and cared for them like extended family. When the lights flickered at closing time, he'd sweep the floor and whisper, "This place feeds us, but it also defines us." To him, the business wasn't simply survival, it was identity. Over time, it became the spine of our family's pride. Each milestone expanding inventory, opening another branch, winning community recognition was celebrated like the birth of a child. Neighbors didn't just see a shop, they saw resilience. They saw a symbol of what persistence could build when money was scarce, but love was abundant. Every late night, every early morning, etched the business deeper into our story, until its name was inseparable from ours. I inherited that legacy not with entitlement, but with awe. I knew I was walking into footprints carved by people who had chosen integrity over shortcuts, service over greed. For me, maintaining the business wasn't about balancing ledgers. It was about honoring the voices of those who had worked without complaint, about keeping alive the essence of who we were. That is why betrayal cuts so deep. Because when you look at the business as just an asset, you strip away its soul. To me, it was not merely a structure of walls and contracts. It was the vessel of my grandfather's dreams, the echo of my father's laughter, and the very stage where our family's story unfolded. Selling it was never just a transaction. It was an attempt to erase our history. This was more than money. This was our legacy, stitched into every corner, guarded by the memory of those who built it, and worth more than anyone outside the family could ever understand. It always starts small, so small, you convince yourself you're imagining things. At first, I noticed the way his eyes lingered on the cash drawer just a little too long, as though the numbers written on the ledger weren't enough for him. Then came the casual comments over dinner, spoken with a smile sharp enough to cut. "You know," he'd say, swirling his glass, "we could make a fortune if we just sold everything. Think of the freedom. Think of what that money could do." I brushed it off. People fantasize all the time. But soon the comments multiplied, each one carrying a little more weight, a little more arrogance. He began dropping hints about new houses, vacations, expensive cars, things our family had never measured life by. His words dripped with impatience, as if the steady, honest growth of the business wasn't fast enough for him. The first real crack appeared when he started pressuring me to sign documents I hadn't read, insisting they were routine. He laughed off my hesitation, waving his hand like I was an old relic clinging to outdated caution. "Come on," he'd say, "don't you trust me?" But trust, once questioned, is rarely restored. I noticed how his tone shifted in meetings. With longtime employees, he'd lean back in his chair, speaking with the kind of authority that didn't belong to him, promising changes no one had approved. The staff grew uneasy, whispering when they thought I couldn't hear. It was as if he had already begun to imagine himself at the helm, reshaping what generations had built to suit his own vision. Arrogance turned into entitlement. He started walking through the business like a buyer touring property he already owned, tapping walls, shaking his head, muttering about renovations and upgrades. One day, he even joked, though his eyes gave him away, that maybe the family didn't need to cling so tightly to something that could fetch millions on the market. What unsettled me most wasn't his greed, but his growing distance from the values that defined us. The laughter we used to share at the close of a hard day vanished, replaced by calculating stares. He spoke less about customers and more about numbers, less about legacy and more about profit. The business that once felt like home to both of us suddenly seemed like a cage he was desperate to escape if only he could find the right buyer. The signs were everywhere if I allowed myself to see them. The restless energy, the inflated pride, the subtle digs at my old-fashioned ways, and then the late-night phone calls I overheard through half-closed doors, where his voice dropped to a whisper, sealing plans I was never meant to hear. In those moments, a truth settled in my chest like ice. Something was off. He wasn't just dreaming of a windfall. He was preparing for it. And if I didn't stay alert, his greed would not only rob me of the business, it would erase the very soul of our family's legacy. It was late one evening when I first stumbled onto the truth. The business had finally quieted after a long day. The hum of machinery silenced and the office dim except for the pale glow slipping under his closed door. I hadn't meant to linger, but something in me resisted going home. Call it instinct or maybe fear that pulled me down the hall toward the sound of his muffled voice. I paused, hand hovering over the knob when I caught the words that froze my blood. Yes, it's cleaner if she never sees the contract. Once the ink dries, the buyer takes over immediately. For a moment, my heart refused to believe my ears. I pressed closer, the wood biting cold against my cheek, straining to hear every syllable. His tone wasn't tentative. Not cautious, it was confident, assured, like someone who had already declared victory. I waited until silence returned, then quietly slipped away. My hands shook as I reached my car. I told myself it must be a misunderstanding, that I'd misheard, that fatigue was clouding my judgment. But doubt gnawed at me. The next day I searched his office under the guise of routine. That's when I found them papers tucked carelessly in a drawer, bold letters shouting purchase agreement. The numbers were staggering, more than enough to tempt even the strongest heart. But what pierced me wasn't the money. It was the signature line. A blank space where my name should have been, replaced instead with his. Shock clawed at my chest. But disbelief quickly turned into something sharper: heartbreak. This wasn't a stranger plotting to strip away our livelihood. This was family. Blood. The person I once trusted to carry forward the sacrifices of those who came before us. Every story my parents told about the late nights, the early mornings, the debts paid penny by penny, all of it reduced to a line item in his deal. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at the documents, fighting tears that burned but refused to fall. Questions swarmed in my head. How long had he been planning this? Who else knew? Was every smile at dinner, every nod of reassurance, nothing more than camouflage for betrayal? That night, the phone calls grew bolder. I overheard him in the kitchen, his voice dripping with satisfaction. She won't even see it coming. By the time she realizes, it'll be too late. Each word struck like a knife, carving away what little trust I had left. I wanted to confront him right then, to shout, to demand answers. But something held me back. Suspense tightened around me like a rope. If I revealed my hand too soon, I risked losing everything. So I stayed silent, watching, listening, gathering. Every clue like pieces of a puzzle. Beneath the heartbreak, a steely resolve began to form. He thought I was blind, but he didn't know that I had already taken steps of my own. His hidden conversations might have revealed his betrayal, but They also ignited my determination to make sure his plan would never succeed. It began with a letter, plain and unassuming, slipped under my office door. At first, I thought it might be routine correspondence, another mundane note about suppliers or payroll. But when I unfolded it, the words hit me with the force of a hammer. A series of emails, printouts from internal servers, and even a few hastily scribbled notes, all carefully compiled, laid bare the plan I had feared yet hoped was only imagined. The first email was simple, clinical. Finalize the transfer by next week. No discussion, no delay. Signed by him. The tone carried an authority that was chilling. Each following message peeled back another layer, revealing whispered agreements with outsiders' clandestine meetings. In conference rooms I'd never been invited to, and calls scheduled at times when I should have been in the loop. As I read through the documents, a sinking feeling settled in my chest. This wasn't just casual talk or idle speculation. It was a coordinated effort, a betrayal meticulously planned. My hands trembled over the pages. The emails included phrases I could never have imagined him writing. She won't notice until it's too late. Ensure signatures are obtained discreetly. We need to act before she returns. I remembered the countless nights we had spent discussing the future of the business, our hopes, our dreams, and our values. Those conversations, once sacred, now felt like echoes of trust I had foolishly placed. I realized the person I had stood beside for decades had chosen deceit over transparency. Anger welled inside me, raw and unrelenting, not just at the audacity of the plan, but at the callousness with which he treated everything we had built. Each page, each email was a knife twisting deeper into the story of our lives. Yet beneath the rage, there was another emotion hardened. Resolve. This was no longer about shock or hurt. It was about action. It was about ensuring that the legacy my family had built, brick by brick, would not be stolen, manipulated, or erased. I cross-referenced the emails with internal meeting logs and calendar entries. Sure enough, every suspicious action had a traceable pattern. Conversations meant to be private, rooms booked at odd hours, calls taken in hushed tones, all confirming what my instincts had known for weeks. It was like watching the villain of a story slowly reveal himself, confident that the hero would never catch up. But I had caught up. Each document I collected, each note I made, became a piece of armor. I could feel a shift within myself, a transition, from disbelief to strategy. This betrayal, though personal and painful, was also a map away to understand how far the other party was willing to go. And how meticulous I needed to be in countering every move. I also found financial statements, indicating that negotiations had already begun with potential buyers. Figures that should have been discussed with me as Conor had been quietly shifted with contingencies designed to lock me out. All right. Every email, every memo, every hurried signature was a lesson in deceit, but also a guide to how it could be undone. By the end of that evening, I sat back in my chair, breathing heavily, staring at the pile of evidence. I allowed myself only a brief moment to grieve, not just for the betrayal, but for the innocence lost. Then I closed the files and locked them in my drawer. Determination replaced despair. This was no longer a story of what had been taken. It was the beginning of a story about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. And in that quiet moment, promised myself one thing. I would not let the years of sweat, sacrifice, and love that had built this business be erased without a fight. I would act with precision, patience, and an unyielding resolve. Because some legacies are too precious to be left in the hands of the unworthy. Weeks before the first hint of betrayal, I had quietly initiated steps that no one else knew about. It was subtle, deliberate, and almost invisible. Like a shadow moving across the room while everyone else focused on the bright light of their own plans. The deed to the family business, the heart of everything we had built, had been quietly revised, legally binding, and protected in ways that would make any attempt at unilateral sale impossible. I remembered the first conversation. with my lawyer Daniel late one evening over cups of lukewarm coffee. I hadn't explained the full situation, only hinted at concerns that seemed unlikely to anyone else. His eyes, steady and discerning, understood immediately. He didn't rush, didn't panic. Instead, he outlined a strategy that balanced legal precision with discretion. Every clause, every contingency would be designed to protect not just ownership, but the essence of the family's legacy. The process began with meticulous review. We combed through years of past agreements, trust clauses, and shareholder records. Each document was examined not only for legal compliance, but also for the subtle ways an insider could exploit loopholes. And then, quietly, we implemented protections that would be triggered only under specific circumstances, like a trapdoor in a room no one else could see. The deed was rewritten to include clauses that required unanimous consent for any sale, disclosure of negotiations, and binding verification of signatures. Hidden safeguards were embedded, clauses that seemed ordinary to a casual reader but were in fact shields, designed to prevent exactly what was now being attempted. The psychological impact of having taken these steps was profound. While I read through the evidence of betrayal, my anger was tempered by an underlying calm. I knew the board of the business, the legal authority, and even the courts would see the truth embedded in the documents. This knowledge was more than comfort, it was power. The feeling of being one step ahead, of holding a secret that no one else suspected, created a clarity of purpose that sharpened my mind like a blade. Yet the countermove was not just about legality, it was about timing. Everything had to be executed with patience, without letting suspicion arise. Any premature action could alert the antagonist, causing them to act faster, more aggressively, or find ways to circumvent the protections. So I continued my outward routine, appearing preoccupied, absorbed in daily operations, all the while preparing the moment when the hidden protections would reveal themselves at the right time. Even the smallest details mattered. I ensured that critical documents were stored securely, accessible only to those who truly needed them. Emails were timestamped carefully, meetings logged precisely, and every interaction was noted in private records. The illusion of inattention, the appearance that I was unaware of what was happening, was essential. While they plotted, I moved quietly, like water filling the gaps of a vessel, knowing that the moment of confrontation would arrive when I was fully prepared. When the deed was officially recorded, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Not triumph, not vengeance, but a deep sense of control. I had preserved the business, safeguarded the family's legacy, and created a legal barrier that even the most brazen attempt at betrayal could not bypass. Every clause, every hidden safeguard was a testament to foresight, patience, and understanding. The stakes beyond money, the stakes of trust, identity, and honor. The next step was psychological. I had to wait until the antagonist made a move, confident that they were in control. That anticipation, the knowledge that their next attempt would be thwarted, sharpened my focus. I could almost hear the wheels turning in their mind, unaware that the board, the law, and my foresight were aligned against them. This was the power of being prepared, of knowing the terrain before the battle began, and when the day came, as I expected, their arrogance led them straight into the trap. Documents signed without full consent. Conversations conducted in hushed tones, all of it collided with the legal barriers I had silently put in place. The letters, the emails, the evidence of their intentions were no longer just proof. They became part of a larger narrative of control, resilience, and strategic foresight. I felt a surge of clarity that night, not because the deed was legally binding, but because I had anticipated betrayal and countered it before it could take root. It wasn't about revenge. It was about protection. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about mastery. In that quiet moment, I realized the true power wasn't in reacting, it was in planning, in foresight, in knowing that sometimes the best defense is the one your adversary never suspects. As I closed the files and sat back in my chair, The weight of weeks of careful strategies settled in. The family business, the legacy, the years of sacrifice and devotion. It was safe. Then even more, it was untouchable to those who would act out of greed and arrogance. I had not only defended what was mine, I had rewritten the rules of engagement, quietly, deliberately, and irrevocably. It started subtly, as if trying to mask the storm that was coming. Calls that once felt routine now carried a sharper edge. Questions about new opportunities and strategic partnerships were peppered into casual conversations. Innocent on the surface, but brimming with intention beneath. I noticed the shift immediately, the cadence of speech. The uncharacteristic insistence on urgency. The carefully timed reminders of debts and obligations. It was all preparation, a prelude to the real move that would soon unfold. Then came the day when the betrayal could no longer remain hidden. I was called into the conference room, ostensibly for a routine review of quarterly numbers. The room was filled with people I barely recognized, potential buyers. Business consultants, legal advisors, all gathered under the guise of strategic expansion. Their smiles were practiced, professional, but there was an unmistakable energy of anticipation in the air. They were waiting for approval, for my consent, for the nod that would give them legitimacy. The antagonist, a relative whose ambition had long been simmering beneath polite conversation, stood at the head of the table. Their tone was confident, bordering on arrogant as they outlined the plan. "We have a buyer ready," they began, voice smooth, controlled. "All that's left is the formal agreement. With your cooperation, we can finalize the sale immediately." Their eyes flicked toward me, searching, calculating, expecting compliance. It was the moment they had been waiting for, the apex of their orchestrated betrayal. I listened quietly, letting each word sink in, feeling a mix of emotions, anger, disbelief, and a deep, simmering disappointment. This was not just about money. This was about trust, about the family history they had disregarded, about the countless sacrifices that had built the business into what it was today. Every anecdote, every meeting, every late night and early morning spent nurturing this legacy was now being dismissed with a polished smile and a handshake. What struck me most was the audacity of it all. They had assumed that my silence, my apparent disinterest, meant ignorance or acquiescence. That assumption, that blind confidence, would be their undoing. I could see it in the way the buyers shifted nervously when I didn't respond immediately, in the subtle hesitation that began to creep into the carefully constructed facade. The tension in the room was electric. Every statement from the antagonist was met with my calm, deliberate pauses. Each attempt to persuade, to manipulate, was met with silence. I allowed the room to feel the weight of my presence, the authority I carried not from arrogance, but from the unseen safeguards and foresight I had put in place. It was a quiet but powerful contrast, their outward confidence versus my inner control as the meeting progressed. The first cracks appeared. The buyers, sensing uncertainty, began to ask questions about approvals, about signatures, about the legitimacy of the proposed sale. Each question highlighted the gaps in the antagonist's plan, the overlooked clauses, the protections embedded within the deed. The realization dawned on them slowly but unmistakably. This sale could not proceed without full, documented consent. And that consent did not end, would not exist. I watched the color shift in the antagonist's face, the subtle twitch of a hand that once gestured confidently, now clenched in frustration. Their arguments grew sharper, voices rising slightly, but the legal barriers I had quietly established remained unyielding. The room, once orchestrated like a stage for their triumph, now felt uncertain, tense, exposed. In that moment, I understood the full weight of betrayal, not just the attempt itself, but the calculated assumption that I would be absent, passive, and compliant. It was a revelation that cut deeper than any words or actions. They had tried to erase me, to rewrite the story of our family's business. believing that history and authority could be bent to their will. And yet, as I sat there quietly, the paradox became clear. Their power so carefully displayed was an illusion. My preparation, my foresight, my refusal to be rushed had turned the tables. What they thought would be a final victory became a showcase of their miscalculation. The betrayal, once seemingly unstoppable, had been contained before it could ever take root. By the time the meeting adjourned, the tension lingered like a heavy fog. I left the room not with confrontation, not with fury, but with a quiet acknowledgement of what had transpired. The betrayal attempt had failed, not through aggression or dramatic exposure, but through patience, planning, and the subtle, unyielding authority of foresight. That evening, I reflected on what had occurred. Betrayal is a force that tests the strength of foundations, but it also reveals character. The antagonist had revealed theirs in full, their ambition untempered by consideration or respect. And in contrast, I had revealed mine steadfast, calm, and deliberate, rooted in both legacy and strategy. The power of being prepared had never been clearer, and the family business and everything it represented remained intact. The day of reckoning arrived quietly, almost deceptively. The office felt like any other morning, phones ringing, assistants shuffling papers, the faint hum of air conditioning filling the corners of the room. But beneath the ordinary tension had been accumulating for weeks, now coiling like a spring ready to release. I knew exactly what was coming. Yet I carried myself with calm that belied the storm. The antagonist arrived with their usual confidence, a practiced smile, a polished briefcase filled with contracts and agreements. Their presence exuded certainty, the kind of certainty that assumes victory is inevitable. They greeted colleagues with nods and handshakes, all designed to convey power and control. Then they turned toward me, expecting compliance, expecting the ceremonial nod that would greenlight the sale. Instead, they were met with quiet observation. My eyes held steady, my expression unreadably contrast to the eagerness in theirs. They launched into their presentation, outlining the finalized deal with an air of triumph. Numbers were recited, timelines discussed, clauses referenced. Everything was in place, or so they thought. "We've secured all necessary approvals," they said confidently, eyes flicking toward mine as if to catch any hesitation. "Once we have your sign-off, the transaction is complete." I listened, letting each word hang in the air, the tension stretching taut like a wire. The room waited for my response, for the signal that would either allow the plan to proceed or halt it in its tracks. I inhaled slowly, then spoke. "The deed has already been changed," I said, deliberately calm, deliberately precise, legally, fully, with proper documentation. "The sale cannot and will not proceed without my consent, which is not given." For a moment, silence. Not the comfortable silence of a quiet room, but the heavy, disbelieving silence of shock. Faces went pale, jaws slackened, eyes widened. The antagonist's confident posture faltered, their polished masks slipping as the truth settled in. The room, which had been primed for celebration on their behalf, now seemed to shrink around them. Their words, so meticulously rehearsed, had no power against the reality of the deed. "What do you mean?" The antagonist finally managed, voice tight edge cracking. That's impossible. The papers, I mean, exactly what?" I said. I interrupted gently, letting each syllable land. "The legal changes were completed weeks ago. The deed was transferred under conditions that protect the family legacy. No transaction can override it. No agreement you bring forward is valid without my explicit approval." I could see the panic creeping in now, subtle but unmistakable. Their plans, the carefully orchestrated manipulation, the assumed inevitability of success, it all collapsed under the weight of foresight and preparation. Colleagues who had been ready to nod in agreement shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden imbalance, unsure where allegiance now lay. The room's energy changed instantly. What had been a meeting of potential celebration became a courtroom of consequences. Every word, every gesture from the antagonist now seemed desperate, reactive. As they tried to regain control over a situation they no longer dominated, their tone grew sharper, more insistent, but the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. I held the floor without aggression, without raising my voice. My authority was quiet, unassailable, derived from preparation and clarity. I noticed subtle glances exchanged across the room, board members, advisors, staffs meeting mine with a mixture of respect and relief. They had been waiting unknowingly for this reveal. And now that it had arrived, their reaction was instinctive. Acknowledgement that the truth had prevailed, that the rightful course had been preserved. The sense of justice, unspoken but palpable, filled the room. The antagonist faltered further, their arguments unraveling. They attempted to negotiate, to question the legitimacy of the legal changes. But every point was met with calm, precise explanations, supported by documentation I had quietly secured. Each rebuttal highlighted the meticulous planning that had brought me here, turning their assumed victory into humiliation. The emotional weight of the moment was not lost on me. Betrayal had been attempted, trust had been tested, and pride had been challenged. But the karmic twist, the dramatic reversal, was complete. What they had tried to seize without consent had been protected all along. The tension melted into quiet comprehension, the shock transforming into reluctant acknowledgement. When the meeting concluded, I walked out with measured steps, carrying neither anger nor triumph in my expression, only clarity. The deed was secure, the family legacy intact, and the lesson unmistakable. Foresight, preparation, and steadfast resolve cannot be undermined by arrogance or greed. Outside, the sunlight felt sharper, the air crisper, and for the first time in weeks, I breathed fully, knowing the family business and what it represented was safe. The day after the confrontation, the ripple effects of what had occurred began to spread, subtle at first, then unavoidable. News traveled quietly through the family, like whispers in a corridor that grew louder with every turn. The antagonist, once so poised and confident, now moved with careful calculation, avoiding eye contact and any situation that could reopen the wound of public humiliation. Their carefully constructed image had crumbled, and everyone who had witnessed even a fraction of the confrontation now saw them differently. Family gatherings that had once been casual and light now carried an undercurrent of tension. Conversations paused at awkward moments. Glances lingered longer than necessary. Some relatives, previously neutral or sympathetic to the antagonist, now hesitated to take sides openly. The fracture lines, invisible yet undeniable, appeared in conversations, at holiday dinners and weekend visits. Trust, once assumed, had been eroded beyond repair. Even those who didn't fully understand the legal details could sense that the dynamics had changed irrevocably. Neighbors and longtime friends, people who had watched the family evolve and witnessed decades of shared experiences, began asking subtle questions. Commas dropped lightly in casual conversation. I heard things didn't go as planned with the sale, or I hope everything's okay with the business now. Their curiosity was not malicious, but the quiet awareness added to the sense that the community now recognized a different version of events. People who had once accepted appearances now understood that appearances could be misleading. The antagonist, once commanding attention effortlessly, found themselves increasingly isolated. Invitations that had been automatic dinners, charity, events, informal board discussions now became rare. Their attempts to reassert influence were met with polite resistance or gentle deflection. They had assumed power could be taken through boldness and opportunity. They had not accounted for foresight, for strategy, or for the quiet determination of someone unwilling to be erased. Within the family business itself, operations continued, but the emotional climate had shifted. Employees and partners sensed the tension, adjusting their own behavior accordingly. Some expressed quiet relief that the deed had been secured, while others wrestled with loyalty conflicts. Yet through it all, I remained present, not with vindictiveness, but with clarity and composure. My role had never been about dominance or retaliation. It had been about protecting something larger than any single person's ambition, the family legacy. Emotionally, the fallout was complex. The betrayal cut deep, a reminder of how fragile trust can be even within those closest to us. I allowed myself to feel the hurt fully, acknowledging the sting of arrogance disguised as affection, of greed dressed in familiarity. Tears came unbidden, not as surrender, but as recognition of loss. The loss of assumptions about character, the loss of unspoken assurances that had been broken. Yet anger, though present, was tempered by perspective. I understood that the antagonists' actions revealed far more about their own limitations than they did. About me or the family business. Reflection also brought gratitude. Gratitude for foresight, for quiet preparation, and for the advisors who had guided me with precision. Gratitude for the legal safeguards that had turned potential disaster into an opportunity to demonstrate resilience. Gratitude for the family. Members who had remained quietly loyal, their support now more meaningful because it had been chosen consciously rather than assumed. And gratitude, most of all, for the lesson that foresight and integrity carry power far greater than arrogance ever could. The moral undertone of this period became clear: betrayal, when met with deliberate strategy and quiet vigilance, can be mitigated. Arrogance and greed, no matter how polished, eventually expose themselves. Actions taken without foresight leave trails that cannot be erased, and those who underestimate patience, preparation, and principle will inevitably confront the consequences of their miscalculations. In the broader community, the story became a quiet legend, not told with malice, but with acknowledgement of resilience. Friends, neighbors, and even professional colleagues referenced it as a lesson in vigilance and integrity. The narrative shifted from one of conflict to one of empowerment, a reminder that rights, when quietly defended, are not easily stolen, and that history, once written with intention, cannot be rewritten by audacity alone, even within the family. There were moments of tentative reconciliation, not with the antagonist, but among those who had been divided by loyalty conflicts. Conversations began to repair broken trust lines between cousins, siblings, and longtime partners. There was acknowledgement that while some relationships could never fully recover, others could be nurtured and strengthened by shared values, clarity, and honesty. Ultimately, the aftermath was a mixture of relief, reflection, and resolve. The antagonist's failure was not celebrated loudly, did not require celebration, but its quiet justice resonated. And as I walked through the offices of the family business, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The legacy we had built, forged through decades of work, sacrifice, and shared vision, remained intact. It had weathered an attempt to be dismantled, and in doing so, had grown stronger, not just in legal terms, but in the emotional and moral fabric that defined it. The experience became a defining chapter, a testament to vigilance, patience, and the quiet strength required to protect what matters most. It was a reminder that power without foresight and integrity is temporary, while steadfast principles endure. And as the weeks passed, life returned to a rhythm shaped not by fear or betrayal, but by clarity, intentionality, and a deep understanding of the cost and the value of trust. Sitting quietly in the office that had witnessed decades of hard work, triumphs, and challenges, I let myself reflect on everything that had transpired. Its chaos, the tension, the betrayal, and the quiet strategies that had restored balance. Of it felt like a lifetime condensed into a few intense months. I realized that the true test was never about money, property, or even control. It was about trust, integrity, and the steadfastness required to protect what we value most. I had learned that foresight is not arrogance, it is a shield. Planning, quietly anticipating moves before they happen, and acting with intention are acts of power that require patience, discipline, and clarity. Trust, I now understood, is fragile and precious. It can be broken in a moment by ambition or greed, and once broken, it cannot simply be repaired. The betrayal I had faced was a stark reminder that even those closest to us may act in ways we do not anticipate. But it also reinforced that integrity cannot be dictated by others. Protecting one's principles, family legacy, and personal rights demands courage, vigilance, and sometimes quiet confrontation. It is not always about dramatic gestures or visible victories. Often, it is about holding firm when the world expects. Submission, about preserving what is true even when no one is watching. Resilience became my quiet companion through this ordeal. The emotional turbulence of seeing someone attempt to rewrite our shared history tested my composure. Yet each calculated step I had taken, securing the deed, gathering evidence, collaborating with trusted advisors, revealed the strength that comes from preparation. Resilience is not merely enduring hardship. It is moving through it with awareness and emerging intact, even stronger, without letting the actions of others diminish your sense of self or purpose. I realized that true empowerment comes from the combination of foresight and courage, the ability to act decisively without being driven by anger or revenge, but by clarity and principle. In the months that followed, I noticed subtle changes around me. Relationships that had been strained began to stabilize, grounded now in transparency and honest communication. Friends and family who had observed the events from the sidelines expressed respect not for the confrontation itself, but for the integrity and dignity with which it had been handled. I learned that influence is not about force. It is about consistency, preparation, and the quiet demonstration of moral authority. Others may attempt to claim your space or rewrite your story, but your foresight, values, and actions form an unshakable core that no one can truly erase. The family business, the heart of this entire saga, continued to thrive not just as a financial entity, but as a symbol of perseverance, vision, and shared effort. Each meeting, each decision, each interaction was imbued with a renewed sense of purpose. I understood that legacy is not a static artifact. It is living, breathing, and shaped daily by decisions, actions, and the values we pass forward. Protecting that legacy is both responsibility and honor, and the events of the past months underscored the importance of vigilance, honesty, and courage in safeguarding it. Reflecting on the antagonist's failed attempts, I found no need for lingering resentment. Their actions had revealed their character, but they had not defined the outcome. Justice had been restored quietly, deliberately, and firmly, without theatrics or spectacle. This quiet reclamation was far more powerful than any public display could have been. It affirmed that integrity, preparation, and principled action carry more weight than manipulation or short-term cunning. As I closed my journal, a sense of calm settled over me. The lessons were clear: trust wisely, anticipate boldly, protect fiercely, and act with dignity. Betrayal is an inevitable part of life, but so is the ability to respond with wisdom, foresight, and moral clarity. I had reclaimed my rightful place, preserved what mattered most, and, in doing so, strengthened not only the family business, but also my sense of self. Empowerment is not measured by the control one exerts, but by the ability to stand undiminished in the face of deceit, to protect what matters, and to let justice unfold naturally through careful, deliberate action. Resilience is not reactive, it is proactive, grounded in foresight and patience. And in this, I found the true reward: the restoration of balance, the preservation of legacy, and the affirmation that integrity, above all else, endures. This story, that began with betrayal, had ended with clarity, strength, and dignity. And as I looked ahead, I knew that while life would bring more challenges, I was no longer a bystander. I was a guardian of truth, a witness to legacy, and a participant in the narrative that I had the right and the power to shape.